Hello and welcome to this lecture on theories of tourist motivation from the perspectives of psychology and sociology. Firstly, from a psychological perspective. Plog was writing in 1974 about tourist typologies, and he's continued with this vein of research well up into the 90s and early 2000s. Essentially, Plog divided up the tourist market depending on how adventurous they were. These are psychographic dimensions. He placed tourists on a continuum of tourist types. At one end are the psychocentric tourists. These are the tourists who are unsure and insecure about travel. They travel to places that tend to be similar to their home. In the middle, and this is where most tourists will lie, are the mid-centric. They prefer to go to destinations that are known. They don't explore. They don't seek new adventures, and they follow the discoveries that have been made by more adventurous tourists. These more adventurous tourists are known as allocentrics. They are independent. They seek cultural exploration and adventure. And according to Plog, writing in 1974, they often have an above-average income. Cohen, also writing in the 70s, came up with typologies that were quite similar to Plog's. He also placed tourists along a continuum based upon the psychographic dimension of essentially adventurousness. So his continuum runs from familiarity through to novelty, in much the same way that Plog's dimensions go from psychocentric to allocentric. But he's put in a few more categories here. He's divided these up into institutionalized tourism and non-institutionalized tourism. Institutionalized tourism refers to that which deals routinely with the tourism industry, tourism operators, travel agents, hotels and tour groups, people who utilize all of the instruments of the tourism industry to make their trip easy. Non-institutionalized tourism is where individual travelers shun contact with the tourism industry except where absolutely necessary. Now, when I finished my undergraduate degree in 1995, I went off to go on an extended surfing trip through Indonesia after spending almost 2 years living in Papua New Guinea. And I had an open itinerary, a surfboard, a backpack and a guitar, and no plans. And I travelled using local transport, I stayed in local hotels, didn't use any of the tourism infrastructure that was provided. To me, that was the way that I wanted to travel, and that was what is referred to a non-institutionalized tourist. Conversely, someone who was an institutionalized tourist may have booked everything in advance, would have transfers organized from the hotel, a tour company would pick them up, take them to the hotel, maybe they would have a number of excursions planned and then they would return home. Underneath institutionalized tourism, Cohen breaks these down into the organized mass tourist and the individual mass tourist. The organised mass tourist just does the package tours, doesn't have much contact with local culture or people other than those working in the tourism industry. The individual mass tourist also takes these package tours, but they have a little more flexibility than the organised mass tourist. They might actually take a walk outside of their hotel or book a tour that wasn't already included in their package. Moving to the non-institutionalised tourists, explorers tend to get off the beaten track, but they do prefer comfortable accommodation and reliable transport. Drifters, on the other hand, try to get as far from familiarity as possible. They live with local people, immersing themselves in local culture. They have no fixed itinerary. They are not going to established accommodation suppliers, but maybe they are approaching the heads of villages in remote rural destinations and asking if they can sleep with them. Or they will tend to open up new tourism destinations which may then be visited by the explorers. Eventually a tourism industry will develop and you'll start to get the institutionalized tourists attending these places as well. Another psychological way of understanding tourist motivation was based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs suggests that there are a number of needs that people have, and they can be placed in a pyramid. And that people are wanting to get to the top of that pyramid, but in order to move up to the next stage, the earlier, lower levels of needs need to be satisfied first. And the first order needs are physiological needs: food, water, shelter, and survival. Once you have these things sorted out, then you can feel about safety needs, feeling secure or unafraid. Once you have these things figured out, then you start looking for things like affection, friends, and love. Once those things are figured out, then you can become concerned with things like confidence and prestige, before eventually shooting for self-actualization, which is to become everything that one is capable of becoming. Philip Pearce essentially put 2 lines up the outside of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and called it Pearce's travel career ladder. His idea is that you can consider your travel career, how you travel throughout the course of your life, as a career, and that through this career you should be looking to ascend this travel career ladder. That perhaps in your first forays as a tourist you're just looking to satisfy those lower order needs, and as you become a more adept traveller throughout your travel career, your needs as a tourist are advancing and evolving with you to get to that point of self-actualization where travel can help you become everything that you are capable of becoming. Some of the criticisms of these psychological approaches to tourism motivation are, in the case of Plog and Cohen, that they tend to reduce tourist motivation down to a single psychographic constituent, that is, how adventurous people are. There are clearly more factors at work than that. Pearce's travel career ladder similarly assumes that everyone is trying to ascend this ladder throughout their travel career, whereas some people do not seem to be interested in self-actualization, but are maybe looking more for fun in a manner which keeps them at some of these lower order needs, that they tend to regress backwards down the travel career ladder in order to have fun in ways that they did perhaps when they were younger. Chris Ryan writes about travel motivators, and he has this list of travel motivators that's quite short, but really accounts for most imaginable tourist motivations. That tourists are either looking to escape from a mundane environment, they're looking for relaxation and recuperation, for opportunities to play, to strengthen family bonds, for prestige, social interaction, education, wish fulfillment, or shopping. Pretty much anybody's travel is going to fit into one or more of these categories. Many of them are pretty obvious. Some of the ones that people don't often admit to are those of prestige. This is the kind of travel that people go on so they can brag to other people that they've been on this kind of travel. For example, I remember being a young adult and talking to a friend of mine. Both had dreams of travelling extensively, but our reasons for doing this were really quite different. Mine were far more along the escaping from a mundane environment and education perspective, whereas for him, he would say things like, I can't wait to go to Egypt so I can get a photograph of myself standing on top of the pyramids and put that photograph on the wall of my living room. For him, it was about having photographs taken at the world's great landmarks so that they could be conversation pieces in his home. On another occasion, I was taking a group of students to a lagoon in Baja California in Mexico, where the California grey whales breed. Now, this is a unique place to view whales because they will actually come right up to your boat, and mothers with calves will push the heads of these baby whales into the boat so that you can actually pat them. It's quite remarkable. I was down there with a group of students and also a group of members from the public. Almost everybody had touched a whale except for one woman. And this particular woman had spent the whole trip bragging about all of the very expensive nature trips that she'd taken, which had included a number of trips to Antarctica, icebreaker ships with helicopters, and landing on the Arctic tundra and hanging out with penguins. Now, she was very annoyed that she hadn't managed to pat a whale. And it got to the point where her complaining became so incessant that one of my students picked her up physically. She was just a small lady, held her over the side of the boat, and she reached down and touched a whale for the first time. And she shrieked with pleasure and shouted, "My friends from Antarctica are going to be so jealous when they hear about this." And that had appeared to be her primary motivation for this whole trip, was to make other people jealous rather than being there for the enjoyment of the trip itself. And this is an example of prestige as a travel motivator. Optimal arousal theory suggests that individuals have different comfort levels of stimulation and will constantly attempt to reach them. So if you have an existence that you find is too stimulating, in order to reach a level of homeostasis, you would, according to this theory, choose less stimulating travel choices. If you found your life too boring or mundane, you might choose instead high stimulation travel choices in order to reach this desired balance of stimulation. Moving on to sociological perspectives of tourism motivation. Daniel Boorstin, who was an American Republican and the librarian at the Library of Congress for some time, had written in 1961 a book called The Image, A Guide to Pseudo-Events in America. He was quite a cynical man, and he didn't like the way that the culture of celebrity and movies and the generation of fake narratives in society, he didn't like what that was doing. And he said in 1961, so pretty early on, tourism once offered a passport to reality. It now provides artificial products in which picturesque natives fashion papier-mâché images of themselves for tourists who expect to see scenes out of the movies. So he's saying that tourists are not expecting reality, they're expecting a manufactured reality that they have seen in the media, and that native peoples around the world are producing those scenes that the tourists are expecting, even though it's not an accurate reflection of their culture. And there are certainly examples of this from around the world. This is a photograph of a cultural dance in Fiji. It was billed by the backpacker hostel in front of which this performance is taking place as a Fijian cultural dance. Now, fire twirling is not a cultural dance in Fiji. It has no place in Fijian traditional dancing. There is one small community on the island of Yanutha that has a fire dance, but it consists of people stomping around on burning coconut husks, not twirling sticks of fire as you see in here. This is a completely imported dance. It's certainly visually arresting and entertaining, but it has nothing to do with Fijian culture. But the tourists have been led to expect that there will be these kinds of spectacular fire dances in Pacific cultures, and so the tourism industry is giving them what they want. Now, this all takes place next to a mock Fijian village that is only there to look like a real Fijian village, and this tiki pool. Now, again, these tiki motifs have absolutely nothing to do with Fijian culture, and I'm still not quite sure what the intention was with this. But here it is, and it's meant to communicate to guests something authentic-y about Pacific culture, but with no actual references to anything real about Fijian culture. Dean MacCannell also talks about the idea of authenticity in tourism, but he kind of turns Daniel Boorstin's idea on its head, where Boorstin suggested that people are out looking for the fake and that that's what they're getting. Dean MacCannell suggests that tourists are actually looking for the authentic. Given a lack of meaning in their own lives, they're looking for meaning in the authentic lives of others, but they're unable to find that. MacCannell based his work on Goffman's ideas of front stage and backstage, where front stage, if you think about it in terms of a theatre, is where the show goes on. There's a very polished performance that hides the fact that the actors have been rehearsing this for months and months and months, and they're frantically backstage putting their makeup on and getting their costumes on and rehearsing their lines and trying to make sure that everything goes fine, and they step onto that stage and the polished performance is perfect. MacCannell says the same thing happens in tourism. What you see as a tourist, for the most part, is this show on the front stage. It's what you see, but it's not the authentic lives of others that tourists are really searching for. That all takes place backstage, where all the preparations are being put together. And MacCannell says that it's virtually impossible for tourists to access the backstage and the truly authentic lives of people in tourist destinations unless perhaps they were to get lost walking around a local community and happen to peer over the back fence of someone's house and see some real interactions taking place outside of the sphere of tourism. English sociologist John Urry has written extensively about tourism as one of the more influential theorists in this area. And he wrote a book in 1990 and re-released an updated version in 2002 called The Tourist Gaze. This was based on French historian Michel Foucault's medical gaze, the dehumanizing medical separation of the patient's body from the patient's person. So if you've ever been into the doctor, or if you've been with someone or you yourself have had surgery, you might have had that feeling where the medical staff are disconnected from you as a human being and they're seeing you as a lump of meat that needs repairing. That's what Michel Foucault was talking about, and that's the idea that John Urry brings to tourism, is that tourists are disengaged from the destination in any real way, and they're looking for these signs and symbols that they've been trained to look for. And that's culturally bound and is different between different cultures, and that the tourist gaze can change on a whim from one thing to another. So it's culturally constructed. There is no single tourist gaze. Depending upon the influences placed on people in their lifetime, tourists are drawn to different kinds of tourist sites. And what tourists look for reflects their own culture to a large degree, far more than it does the culture that they're visiting. And we tend to try and direct the tourist gaze as well. These are photographs of places where a local tourism industry is really directing the tourists, saying, look, you need to take a photo of this. This is what you want to take a photograph of. Generally speaking, the tourists will oblige them. This is a good example of culturally bound meanings associated with the tourist gaze. This is Gallipoli in Turkey. And you probably have never heard of this place before. When I ask my American students, they've also never heard of Gallipoli in Turkey. They've heard of Turkey, but Gallipoli means nothing to them. For Australians and New Zealanders, Gallipoli means a lot. This is the site of an important First World War battle where tens of thousands of Australians and New Zealanders were killed. The battle itself is kind of a long story. Suffice to say that the Australians and New Zealanders were trapped on a beach with high bluffs behind it, with Turkish soldiers in great numbers, just mowing them down. And so this is the site of one of our greatest wartime defeats. And it's something that is celebrated, or at least in Australia and New Zealand, there is a public holiday dedicated to Anzac Day. And these were the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps that landed on this beach in the First World War and were almost completely decimated. Many Australians have relatives, ancestors who died on the beaches here, and every year on Anzac Day, many of them make a pilgrimage to Gallipoli. Even if they don't make it on that specific day, many Australian and New Zealand tourists will come and pay homage at this site where so many people died. Now, it's also just kind of a beautiful beach destination, and you'll see tourists from other countries there as well, wandering around thinking, wow, what a beautiful beachside community, what a beautiful view. And then you'll see Australian and New Zealand tourists walking around the exact same place, but with very different feelings in their hearts. They may be crying, they may be remembering their grandfathers or great-grandfathers who were killed as teenagers trying to get up this beach. Very different feelings and a very different tourist gaze. Now, the tourist gaze can also have practical implications for tourist destinations. And an example is in Sarawak in Malaysia, where communities live in longhouses. These are great big, literally long houses that the entire community lives in. They don't have individual houses. There's particular styles of longhouse that are particular to some communities. And the image on the left is the one that is in all the tourist brochures, and that's what tourists are looking for. Now, it takes a long time to build a building of this size, and the trouble with building it out of bush materials, as this building is that it needs completely replacing, at least once every 10 years. So what many communities have started doing, where they can afford it, is building longhouses out of more modern materials and using more modern designs. And in the image on the right, you can see that the longhouse is using milled timber. It has a corrugated iron roof which allows them to collect fresh drinking water. The timber has been treated, there are nails. This building may last for 30 to 50 years, but it's not what the tourists have seen in the tourist brochure. And the people in this community were told, unless they took this longhouse down and built a traditional one like the one on the left, that tourists would stop coming to visit their village. Other communities have been told that their style of longhouse design doesn't match that in the tourist brochures and that they should start making the designs that the tourists are expecting, otherwise they might not get tourists as well. So the tourist gaze, informed by the marketing of the tourism industry, is pressuring Indigenous cultures to change their preferences and needs in terms of the housing that they provide for themselves. We've looked at theories of tourist motivation based in psychology and some based in sociology. In our next lecture, we'll look at tourism from the perspective of a consumer decision-making paradigm. If we see tourists as consumers, then tourism can be seen as the result of consumer decision-making processes. Gilbert, in 1991, wrote about a four-stage decision process in tourism based on consumer decision-making paradigms. These involve energizers of demand or push factors, effectors of demand, information and perception of destinations, the roles in decision-making, and filterers of demand or the constraints. Let's look at each of these four stages in turn. The energizers of demand are push factors. Push factors are those things which create a need that needs to be addressed, and this would be addressed through tourism. So in this case, the push factor is extreme stress. Clearly this fellow has been working long and hard into the night. He has a coffee and a drip directly into his veins. He's going to need a holiday to rejuvenate from this level of stress. This is his push factor. The second stage are the effectors of demand or perceptions of destinations. For example, your perception of Fiji as a destination may reflect this image and may reflect this kind of marketing, which is a little old now, but Fiji used to bill itself as the one truly relaxing tropical getaway. I'm sure there are plenty of other tropical getaways that would argue that point, but that is how Fiji was presenting itself. The image of a woman on a beach typifies how they were trying to position Fijian tourism. Now, if this was your perception of the destination, then if your push factor is that extreme stress that we were just looking at, this would look like a pretty good destination for you to address that need for relaxation. However, in 2006, when I was living in Fiji, the military overthrew the democratically elected government, and this was the scene all over the capital city of Suva. Military checkpoints every kilometre or so. Armed soldiers with machine guns checking for people. On the edge of this photo you can see the corner of a white tent. This was just outside the entrance to the University of the South Pacific. Underneath that tent is a .50 caliber machine cannon pointed at the campus, presumably in case the university population was going to rise up against this coup. Now there was razor wire and all kinds of things all over the city. If that was your perception of Fiji, which it was for many people at the time, you probably wouldn't go there for a relaxing holiday. Your perception of that destination would be changed. Even though the destination itself is the same, your perceptions change, you might not necessarily want to go there anymore. Stage 3 in the decision process is about the roles in decision making. So let's take the average American nuclear family, where you have a father, a mother, 2 children. Now their roles and needs in making tourism decisions may be quite different. I'm going to be stereotyping along gender and family role styles here, so my apologies for that in advance. But the father in the family may be thinking about a couple of different things. He may be thinking about the need for kinship, to rekindle familial ties. Maybe he's been working a lot, wants to spend time with the family. He may also be thinking about spending some alone time with his wife while the children are maybe being entertained in other ways at a tourist resort. His wife may be thinking about the shopping opportunities that an airport duty-free store or that international department stores may provide. His son may be thinking about how he's going to be missing his girlfriend back at school and he doesn't really want to go on a holiday anyway. His daughter might be thinking about meeting a like-minded companion on the beach in their tourist destination. So all of them have different motivations for going on the same family holiday. The question is who makes the decisions and who has input into these decisions. And that can vary between different families. In some, the children are going to have a very big part in making a decision about where the family should go. In others, it may be the father, others it may be the mother or the parents working together to make those decisions. Whatever the situation, the roles in decision making will have an influence on the overall outcome. So here's a model of the holiday decision making process. Start off with personal needs, those push factors, and then it becomes a matter of weighing up different destinations. The only way to do that is through the perceptions that you have. Destination image, the impact of advertising, how far is it, what kind of transport is available, have you been there before, do you have any favourable or unfavourable childhood recommendations, have you had a personal recommendation from someone, what are your perceptions of risk in that destination, do you have any particular individual views? And then on the other side, you have the opportunity and constraints that may stop you from going or influence when and where you might be able to go, including family, work, time, money, the available products, your lifestyle, personal preferences, your gender, age and ethnicity, your social circumstances, and your personal values and attitudes. All of these things go into the process of choosing a holiday and deciding to go. The fourth stage in this decision-making process are the constraints. Generally speaking, these are going to be things like time and money. So now that we know some of the psychological motivators for tourism, we've looked at some of the sociological implications of people's various tourist gazes, of their search for authenticity. And we've also seen how consumer decision-making processes work. What do we do with all this information? Well, market segmentation is one of the practical applications of understanding tourist motivation. We can classify tourists into groups or market segments based on their purchasing behaviour, their needs, etc. Tourism suppliers may be able to deliver and or market their products more effectively if they understand specific things about specific sectors of the market. Common bases for segmentation include things like the purpose of travel. Why are people going travelling? Is it to be in the sun? Is it to surf? Is it to dive? Is it to have cultural experiences? And psychographic behavioural characteristics also come into play, and this is more along the lines of the psychological explanations of tourist motivation put forward by Cohen and Plog. Are you very, very adventurous, or are you not very adventurous and really just looking to do something like you might do at home? Demographics are another important base of segmentation. What is your income, your place of residence, your age, your ethnicity, your culture? Different cultures will be marketed to differently. Different products will be developed for different cultures. And despite people self-selecting destinations through that decision-making process of what their needs are, what destinations might satisfy their needs, and their choice being influenced by those psychographic factors of how adventurous are they, how far through their travel career are they, and then also being influenced by the sociological implications of the tourist gaze, of a search for authenticity, the constraints for travel, people may still end up in destinations where they find the culture very challenging to be around. And this can lead to a phenomena called culture shock.